Thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to have you here. I am gonna hand things over to Nancy to do a quick introduction and welcome, and then I will do some housekeeping items.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everybody. We're pleased to see that we have a very large audience that was able to join us today. And as Charlotte had shared, that in addition to our Zoom that we had anticipated that we would have quite a few that would want to attend. So we opened up the live stream. So if you know and are in contact with folks that are not able to log in and have any questions, please know that it is available through live stream, and we can provide additional detail in the chat if that becomes necessary. So today we're going to have the briefing. It is going to be a little bit different than what we've done on our town halls. We're absolutely still open to the chat, and Charlotte's going to talk through a little bit on the Q&A and the chat and kind of how all of that works, because we welcome the questions that folks have today. We do anticipate most of the questions are going to be answered in the presentations that are going to be provided. We are also going to handle the Q&A at the end a little bit differently than we did in the town hall, just to have some assurance that we can answer and address as many of the questions as possible in the time that we have today. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward to having a good presentation and then continued dialogue with our community on this important issue. So Charlotte, and then I believe that we're going to hand it over to Jim or to Stephen Pulowski from Burns and Associate. So thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. So just a few things to go through for any of you who have attended any of our webinars in the past. This will be a repeat, but it's always good to say again. This meeting is being recorded, and this meeting will be posted to the DDS website as soon as it's available. Zoom only allows 1,000 participants, so we have met that threshold, and so now everybody is being redirected to YouTube. YouTube, unfortunately, that is a one-way communication. So if you have questions, please email, and the email is in the description. So it's DDSC19 directives at dds.ca.gov. And then for those of you that are on Zoom, you have the Q&A function. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you will be able to put a question in the Q&A. We have staff that are monitoring that. If we have time, we'll be able to take some of those questions live. And if not, they will be added to our FAQs that will be going onto our website. So for those of you that are on YouTube, you can email in your questions. And again, if we're able to answer a similar question to yours live, we will. Otherwise, we'll collect those questions and add them to our updated FAQs on our website. The chat is for panelists, but we are able to send messages out to all of you as well. So please keep that in mind. And then if you have any questions that don't get addressed today, again, please feel free to email DDSC19 directives at dds.ca.gov. We will put that in the chat so everybody has access to that. And again, it's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. So that's all that I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Knight. I'm with the Department of Developmental Services, and do want to go through, I know there's been, many of you have been with us on, as Nancy mentioned, some town halls, and also helping us work through where we are today with alternative services is what we've called this. And then just for some background, you know, the reason that we're here obviously is due to COVID-19, and it's created some challenges for everyone. Certainly for the individuals who receive regional center services and their families, they still need some supports, and sometimes in some ways they are different supports and services they needed prior to COVID. And because we wanted to be able to set up a model or a way for those services to be provided, we've come up with alternative service models. And again, appreciate the support that a number of you have helped in helping work through this with us. The alternative service model, just briefly, just for some background, really is a way to provide some flexibility for people that meets the needs of individuals who require services. And they are services that are different than what providers typically do. Services may still continue in some ways. Maybe it's remotely, maybe it's in a different place, but they may be some of the same types of services that people were receiving before, but also could include a mix of some different types of services to help support that are unique because of the issues that are going on with COVID-19. So while I know that there are still a lot of questions about kind of exactly what alternative services are and some of the inner workings of those, and I know that creates some angst. Much like everything with COVID, we are kind of working through this together, and do appreciate you helping us do that. We really today want to focus on the rate methodology for setting the monthly rate. One thing I didn't mention is part of the flexibility that we wanted to provide is to create a monthly rate, which allows services to be provided in line with when individuals can receive those services and when it's more convenient. So it's not stuck to or limited to a particular day or particular hours, allows that flexibility to provide the services, not only what those are, but when those services are provided. And so we've talked about doing this at a monthly rate. I know there's been a lot of questions about that. And so this is this is a first step in providing you some more details on how those rates were developed. Now I'm going to introduce Stephen Plowski from Burns and Associates. Now they were involved in developing the provider rate study over the last few years, although that's not what this is. We're really going to be calculating, and Stephen's going to be talking about how rates were developed using information for services that were paid for already. The reason that we are fortunate enough to have Burns and Associates and their team is they're obviously very familiar with the claims and the information within our system. So it's been a great benefit to have them available to help us through this, because although it may seem to be very, in some ways, at a high level, it would seem to be very easy to go and do kind of an average amount of cost per person. There's a lot of different intricacies that Stephen is going to go through and talk about. Now, this presentation is going to be relatively high level. In what that methodology looks like, there is a methodology document that'll be referenced, that'll be available very shortly, that for those of you that want to dig in more detail in how these rates were calculated. Again, this is more of an introductory high level discussion. And so again, when we get to the question and answers, really want to try and focus on those that are specific to the rate determination, how the rates were developed. Any of the other questions, Charlotte mentioned that we have frequently asked questions that are already available that we'll continue to add to, posted on our website. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Great, thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. As Jim mentioned, I am Stephen Plowski with Burns and Associates. I'm joined today by a couple of my colleagues, Stephen Abley and Alisher Abdulev. They are there primarily for my moral support. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak with the California provider and advocacy community. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes talking to you all this afternoon. One of the questions that I've already seen come across today is why Burns and Associates is involved in this. And that's a fair question, and Jim already touched on that. But because that's one of the things I think folks are interested in, I'll spend just a moment talking about that. And that begins by a brief orientation to my organization. Many of you who took part in the rate study or followed that will already have heard this, so I won't spend a lot of time. But ever so briefly, we are health policy consultants. We work almost exclusively with state Medicaid agencies and their sister agencies in the human services departments, particularly in the areas of developmental disabilities and behavioral health. Within that space, some of our particular focuses include rate setting and fiscal modeling, which is why beginning in 2017, we were contracted by DDS to conduct the vendor rate study. And of course, the planning around implementation of that rate study has been interrupted by COVID-19 and the associated difficulties, both in terms of service delivery as well as the state's financial condition. So as Jim mentioned, the work we're doing now to support DDS is not directly associated with the rate study per se, obviously though still associated with provider reimbursement. In terms of why we're providing assistance to DDS in this process, I think there's a couple of reasons. First, it was important that the determination of these monthly rates be handled in a consistent fashion. So that really means it had to take place at some sort of central location, whether that was DDS or a contractor like my organization. But further, I think our firm is well positioned to provide support here because the concept of repricing claims or payment records is what my organization does nearly on a daily basis. Anytime we're involved in a rate setting project like we were in California and like we've done in a dozen plus other states, it always involves us repricing claims as if they had been delivered through the results of a rate study. And the exercise we're doing here is effectively the same thing. We're repricing actual utilization of services pre-COVID at the rates that are currently in effect. We don't want to use the actual payment amounts because there have been a number of changes to those payment amounts over the past year, particularly that January 2020 rate increase that stemmed from the rate study. We also, although not obviously for California specifically, have recently been involved in another project in another state that was very similar in terms of helping them develop retainer payments through their Appendix K authority. So all that being said, we have a lot of generalized experience in terms of working with IDD, HCBS claims and going through repricing exercises. And then in particular, given the amount of time that we spent on the rate project and the fiscal analysis we had to do associated with that rate study, we have a great deal of familiarity already with purchase of service records in California. So the general experience as well as our specific knowledge about the payment purchase service, I should say, I think put us in a good position to provide assistance here to DDS on calculating the payment rates for the alternative non-residential services. One of the nice things about this exercise is that I believe everyone from the department to the regional centers to the vendors has a similar vision about what these monthly rates ought to accomplish. So that's different than when we're doing rate studies where we might agree that we need to pay satisfactory or adequate rates, but people have different opinions about what adequate or satisfactory means. In this particular case, we're all working towards a common goal. And in brief, what we're attempting to do is estimate the amount of monthly funding that providers would expect to receive based upon pre-COVID utilization and current rates. So as a mission statement, I think that's relatively concise and straightforward. When you start to peel it apart, as we'll get into through the duration of this project, it becomes a little bit more complicated. But in effect, it goes back to this concept of repricing. What we've done is we've taken a look at the services that were delivered from March of 2019 through February of 20 and attempted to reprice those at the appropriate rate that is currently in effect. So after bridge funding had been removed, plus any applicable January 2020 rate increase, plus any applicable adjustments for minimum wage increases as well. So although this is something that we do as a matter of course as a consulting firm, and although the mission statement here or the goal that we've published, I think is quite understandable, it actually has taken quite a bit of effort to get us to where we're at here today, ready to present the results of our methodology and on the cusp of having the actual outputs ready to be delivered beginning, I believe, next week is what we'll talk about later in this presentation. And the reason that it's taken as much effort as it has, and this is probably no surprise to those of you listening today, is that there's diversity in terms of how payments are processed across the regional centers across the state. And I have just one example that I'll show you in a moment that helps to illustrate that point. Furthermore, it's possible and probably likely that there are some unique scenarios that we have missed. And for that reason, we've been very diligent in documenting our methodology. We'll be sharing that methodology document. It runs 18 pages, I think, and about 6,000 words. But what we're really committed to doing is making sure that we're processing everything in alignment with the methodology that we have documented. For example, the course of simply cleaning payment records or cleaning claims has 29 different tests associated with it. So we've documented each of those 29 tests, and it could well be there should have been 30 tests, and we just did not come across that 30th one in our QA process. So we want to make sure that we're telling everyone exactly what we did, and as regional centers and vendors take a look at their own results and identify any potential deficiencies, we're able to go back and take a look at the methodology and make a determination about whether or not the omission was significant enough to warrant rerunning anything. For those of you who are more bottom line inclined, the ultimate goal or the ultimate output that we will be producing looks kind of like what we have copied and pasted here on the screen. So we're going to be delivering to the regional centers, who will in turn be delivering to their vendors, a file that includes a lot of upstream work, some of the source documentation, but ultimately the final worksheet in these Excel workbooks is going to look much like what you see right now. For those of you who are involved in the rate study, you know that as a firm, we don't spend a lot of time on formatting, so it's relatively plain vanilla information that you're looking at. But the bottom line, when you look to the far right, is that for a given vendorization, this is my favorite vendor, XYZ456, they have 2 subcodes, and there'll be 2 different monthly rates attached to those subcodes based upon analysis that we'll be talking about in this presentation. But in effect, what the value of the payments were after the repricing and the number of member months involved. So for those who just want to know what is my rate going to be, when you get this file, you can flip to this particular worksheet for each individual service code and then subcode and take a look at what that monthly rate is going to be based upon a given vendorization. If, I should say, we will be delivering this file based upon FEIN. And so for those of you who operate multiple vendorizations under a single FEIN, we'll have a consolidated file for you, at least at the regional center level. We want to try to make this a little bit more manageable. Obviously, a number of providers in the state have quite a few vendorizations, and this will at least put most of the information in one place. We are aware that there are some organizations that have multiple FEINs, and we are not endeavoring to combine those. We don't want to be in a position about mischaracterizing whether or not Community Services, Inc. is the same as Community Services, LLC. So we're not making any assumptions. FEINs are unique, and so we'll be organizing everything by FEIN. And then furthermore, because the distribution is happening by regional center and we can't share protected health information for a different regional center with, say, the originating regional center, it'll have to be a different file if you're an FEIN that serves multiple regional centers. As I said here at the bottom, this final bullet tells you that this is just the final page in a very long process, and that long process will be documented in the file that you will be receiving, and we'll be showing an excerpt of some of the other upstream work later in this presentation. So with all of that preamble out of the way, I'll move on to methodology itself. So if we were to try to describe this formulaically, it would look much like what you see here, that we're looking at monthly units. And so that's taking a look at that utilization from the periods of March of 19 through February of 20, and looking at the current appropriate rate for that vendorization, for that service code, for that subcode. Multiplying the two together gives us a monthly amount for a given month of service. So what we're doing is taking a look at the payment records that apply to a singular month for that vendorization, for that code, for that subcode, and then multiplying it by the current appropriate rates. And each of those payment records then will be translated to a monthly amount that has been repriced. Then, as I mentioned a moment ago, we're just going to add up those monthly amounts across all of the payment records. We're going to divide by the total consumer months, so the number of months of service that were delivered, and that will yield the overall payment rate. So when I put the formula up on the monitor, to me, it looks relatively straightforward, but these steps, particularly determining the appropriate number of monthly units, as well as the current rate, have some complexities that we had not originally envisioned, but that we'll be summarizing here for all of you this afternoon. One last point I'll make on this slide is that We are calculating rates based upon service code and subcode. So if you have multiple subcodes for a single service code within a single vendorization, you'll have multiple rates. And then there are a handful of subcodes that are being excluded. We've probably not yet come up with the exhaustive list, but those that we have excluded really fall into the category of things that are meant to be one-time or cost reimbursement type services. So those are incentive payments, for example, within the supported employment program, internship programs that, as I recall, are typically reimbursed based upon actual wages paid, assessments and evaluations that are meant to be one-time in nature rather than ongoing. And then mileage, although the parenthetical statement here is key, that's mileage for non-transportation services. And so some service codes have a standalone mileage rate that is billed in concert with the hourly units of service. So ordinarily that's priced at the IRS rate or say a state or local mileage rates. In those cases, those have been excluded from these calculations, that we're not providing mileage monthly rates. Again, though, parenthetical is important when we're talking about the transportation service codes for transportation company and transportation additional components. Oftentimes those mileage rates are fully loaded, as I call them, so it also includes the cost of labor. So in that circumstance, that would be part of the mix. It's only for the non-transportation services where the mileage subcodes have been excluded. So that process, or this process, really involves three. The first is we will clean and extract the payment records. Once we've done so, we will reprice those payment records based upon the appropriate current rates. And then finally, we're going to calculate the per consumer per month amounts and translate that to an overall monthly average for that vendorization service code subcode combination. And so if you think back to my formula, the very first circle is this cleaning and extraction process. How many units of service are we working with? The second bubble is the repricing process. What's the current rate that is appropriate for each of those units of service? And then the balance of the equation, both the top and bottom rows, fall into this final step. This final step is actually really easy. It's the hard work up above that have taken quite a bit of effort and thought power to determine how best to do the cleaning, extraction, and repricing processes. So I'll be talking about all of these steps in turn. I'll reiterate the point that Jim raised during his introduction, however, that this is meant to be a high-level overview. The methodology document is going to be shared. As I said, it goes into excruciating detail about exactly what tests we're performing and how that repricing is being undertaken. We'll also be sharing ultimately those vendor level files that will have associated calculations attached to them. So for folks who are really numerically inclined and really want to get their hands dirty with the Excel detail, you'll have the capability of doing that once those files are distributed. But today's process is to provide an orientation to the approach, our philosophy, as it were, to conduct this repricing without necessarily getting into each of the line-by-line details, because even 2 hours would not be sufficient in order for me to do that justice. So step one is cleaning and extracting the payment records. The first thing that we're doing is doing an initial extraction of the purchase of service data. Now, there's quite a bit of fields associated with the payment records. We don't need all of those to do our work. So in order to make the data sets a little bit more manageable, we're just pulling the key codes that we're looking for. So that's the UCI, the regional center, the vendor. You actually notice that service code is excluded from this list. We're certainly looking at service codes, but we're doing each of these analysis in separate standalone files or databases. So that's why you don't see service code listed here, because it is the file itself is pulled by service code. But we are looking at the subcode level of information, the service date, which is the month in which the service was provided, the claim date, which is the month in which the payment was processed. So you might have delivered services in January, but submitted the claim or been paid for those services in February or March or April. And then, of course, the units of service and the payment amount as well. So that's simply taking the information out of the file that we've received from DDS and updated the file that we received as part of the rate study. From here, we now need to go through our cleaning process. And again, the goal is to accurately reflect actual service delivery, specifically and particularly around units of service. Now, I think everyone might read that bullet and think that ought to be awfully easy to calculate the number of units of service. You simply do some addition and call it a day. However, that really is complicated by the different treatments to handle payment adjustments in particular. So I'm just one or two slides, I'll show you what I mean by that. But in general, it falls into categories where a payment has been made, and then after the fact, a payment adjustment is required. That could be for a retroactive rate increase, or it could be due to a reversal, that a payment was made in error, or some other reason why the provider has submitted what we refer to as a negative claim. And so when we started to look through the payment records, we found a lot of different ways that those really standardized things are being treated. In fact, the methodology that we've come up with to handle the cleaning process includes 29 different tests or decision rules. And that's based upon the number of payment records in that month, as well as relationships between those records. And again, I'll show you an example of what I mean by that in just a moment. Ultimately, once we go through our cleaning process and then also through the repricing process, we'll be adding the payment records together as appropriate. Because again, the goal here is to see what the total amount of service delivered in a month was in order to reprice that and calculate that monthly rate. So I wanted to illustrate why this exercise is a little bit more cumbersome than we anticipated it was going to be. What we're talking about is differences in how payment adjustments are being handled across the state. So this is relatively commonplace. Whenever we're working with claims data sets for HCBS services, we see these sorts of things, whether we're talking about reversals or retroactive adjustments. In the example that I've shown you on the screen, we're assuming that the service was originally reimbursed at $12 per unit. However, after payment was made, a decision was made that that rate ought to have been adjusted to $12.50. A higher rate had been negotiated, there was an across-the-board rate increase granted, whatever the case may be. For some reason, it was determined that that $12 ought to have been increased to $12.50. And what I'm showing you are three different ways that that exact same process has been handled across the state. So the first line of each of these three scenarios looks exactly the same. Services were delivered in October of 2019, and in particular, 40 units were delivered. At the $12 rate, that means the payment was $480, and that was paid very timely in November of 2019. The next month, however, for reasons that don't matter to our analysis, the decision was made that that rate ought to have been $12.50 per hour. So in scenario number one, what has been done is 40 hours of service have been, or units of service, I should say, have again been processed at an effective rate of 50 cents per unit, right? That's the difference between the $12.50 and the $12. So that means we have a $20 payment for 40 units, and that was paid the following month in December of 2019. And immediately you can see the complication that arises. When we're processing the payment records, we cannot simply add units in all circumstances. Sometimes that's the right thing to do, but oftentimes it's not. Because in October, there were not 80 units of service delivered. There were only 40, right? If we were to add them together though, 80 would be the result, because the way in this example that adjustment was made was to process the full number of units. So ultimately what we have to do is add up the payment amounts, $500, but not adding the units. It remains 40 units. However, if that was the way it was always handled, that would be straightforward enough. But we found at least two other ways that that exact same adjustment was handled. In some circumstances, the payment record shows a single unit for $20. Once again, we can tell by looking at the months before and after this that it was not a unit reimbursed at $20. It really was the 50-cent difference for the 40 units that was delivered originally. So once again, the right answer is to add the payment amounts, but not to add the units. It wasn't 41 units that was delivered, it was only 40. And then finally, a third approach to handling these payment adjustments was to submit a payment with 0 units attached to it, but the $20 paid. This, in our experience, is pretty unusual. Oftentimes, systems won't process claims with 0 units on them, but nonetheless, this is also, none of these, I wouldn't say are equally common, but these are all somewhat frequent occurrences in terms of how these payment adjustments were handled. In this case, we can add them up because obviously 40 plus 0 remains 40, but these 3 scenarios tell you that for the exact same circumstances, originally 40 hours delivered at $12, and then a retroactive adjustment for another 50 cents per hour, these are the exact same circumstance, but 3 different ways that the payment records come across to us, with either 40 units attached to that adjustment, 1 unit, or 0 units. The same thing is true for payment reversals, where for some reason that $480 had to be rescinded. In some cases, that would come across as negative 40 units, which is great because everything cancels it out. But sometimes it comes across as a positive 1 unit, or a negative 1 unit, or a 0 units. So once again, to handle those payment reversals, we need to be very thoughtful about how it is we're combining payment records. And so my goal here is not to go into all the details, but out of those 29 scenarios I talked about, or 29 tests, 3 of them are illustrated here on this page. And they're all handling the exact same condition. We're trying to do the same thing, but they've been handled in a different way. So that really is the level of effort that went into this process, is first of all, identifying what really is taking place behind the scenes. What was the payment trying to do? And then we had to write effectively programming to handle each of these disparate additional payments in a similar fashion, where the result remains the same, $500 paid for 40 units of service. So once we go through that process, again, testing for all 29 steps, we then re-extract the claims. And those cleaned records become what we work with in the repricing exercise in step number 2, as well as ultimately in aggregating those records and setting the monthly rates. Before I move on to step number 2, there's one small caveat that there are certain payment records that have to skip most of the repricing steps that we're going to be talking about. And that's for a handful of claim circumstances that just don't fit well under our methodology. So the first there are records with 0 units or a blank in the unit field that are not, what we can tell, that are not attached to a payment adjustment. So it's not like the previous exercise where we had 0 units for $20, which were pretty obviously attached to the original 40 units. This is just a record that's coming across with no units on it. The reason we can't reprice that is obvious, because we can't calculate a unit rate, right? If there's no units, we divide by 0, we're going to get an error. So in that circumstance, what effectively happens is it skips all of the repricing steps and moves to the very end, where we simply apply any appropriate January 2020 rate increase. But there's no further exercise that we can go through in terms of cleaning the record or repricing the record. The same thing is true when the records include a unit price of $1. Now, this is the way payments for cost-based services are usually reimbursed, when you're paying by invoice or by report. So that typically involves things like environmental mods or vehicular modifications. It's fairly unusual in our experience to use that approach to typical HCBS, but nonetheless, we find that in some of the results that we got. But once again, when the unit price is $1, what really is happening is you're not paying for a number of units, you're paying for a cost. So it didn't make sense for us to try to think about, was bridge funding included in that rate, or was there a minimum wage adjustment? Once again, the only thing that we can really do is to move that to the very end of the process, apply the January 2020 rate increase if it's applicable, and call it a day, proverbially speaking. And then the last one's a little bit more complicated than the first 2. But there are also circumstances when a provider is already being reimbursed on a monthly basis, but the rate itself varies from month to month. So what that implies to us is, although the payment unit has been set up as a monthly unit of service, there's actually some sort of tracking going on underneath that that requires the provider to bill based upon something that's more fee for service, like say hours of service. There are certainly instances when there's a monthly unit that is the same every single month, $1,200 or whatever it is, and then that does fit with our existing process. But if the rate varies every single month, our assumption is that it's varying based upon utilization, And we're not trying to change utilization, we're trying to reflect real utilization. So once again, those records are going to be skipped to the very end of the process. The January 2020 rate increase will be applied when it's applicable, but there's no further repricing that takes place when it's a monthly unit and a different payment rate every single month. I mean, that's fairly unusual, but we wanted to be fairly descriptive here in this presentation. So that takes us through step one. Step two is actually the one that has been the most time consuming. And once we've cleaned the payment records, which are fairly intuitive once you take a look at the month of service around it that came before and came after, you can usually get a pretty good feel for what the right answer is. The repricing oftentimes was not as straightforward, and I'll get to those non-straightforward examples in a minute. But let's start with our standard repricing approach. And this is something that everyone can do in their living rooms, so to speak. There are a handful of things that everyone knows we need to adjust those payments for. The first is removing bridge funding. So for our purposes, that was in effect through May of 19 through February of 20, right? Because those months are included in our baseline period. But we know bridge funding was one time in nature, and it wasn't meant to be part of a permanent increase in base rate. So ultimately, any bridge funding amounts are going to have to be backed out. Then we also know that we'll need to add any January 2020 rate increase to services that were delivered prior to 2020. Again, the goal is to think about what the rate is on a going forward basis. And on a going forward basis, that 2020 rate increase remains the law of the land, so to speak. So we need to build that back in to services that were delivered in 2019. And on a technical note, there are instances when we see that the 2020 rate increase was not granted immediately in January. So we also have to do some repricing there as well. And then the third kind of standard adjustment is adding in any 2020 minimum wage adjustment back to the 2019 payment records. So if a minimum wage adjustment was granted for beginning in January, we need to add that same adjustment back in the months of March through December. So one of the things that vendors and regional centers will be encouraged to do is to go through a similar exercise as we have done, hopefully spending a little bit less time than we've spent on it. But if you do these three adjustments, you really ought to come very, very, very close to what our ultimate result is. Now, there are some records that have payments that don't quite make sense when we're just looking at these three adjustments that we've had to make special accommodation for. But when we are kind of tallying up where we've had to make adjustments where things have flowed through as we expected them to, nearly 90% of records fall into just these kind of standardized adjustments where everything is working exactly as we expect it would. And so given that this really straightforward process applies to almost 90% of the total payment records, if you were to do this on your own time, your result ought to be very close to our result. The 10% that we'll be talking about in just a moment is going to almost guarantee that our numbers will not be exact, but they ought to be very, very close. And so that's my segue here at the bottom is our methodology also accounts for instances when the effective rate is contrary to the expected value. So these are things that we expect to see that are easy for us to effectively eyeball and build in or take out as the case may be from the actual payment amounts. But then there are those 10-ish% of records where the result is just contrary to expectations based upon what we knew for the bridge funding, the 20 rate increases, and the 2020 minimum wage adjustments. And so this is a grossly simplified version of how it is we've approached instances when the value is just not what we thought it was going to be. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we're showing an instance where a rate is lower than we would anticipate. So this is the way we did a lot of our work to devise our methodologies, was just layering, or excuse me, I should say stacking the months on top of each other, taking a look and seeing, yes, everything makes sense. Rates go up when bridge funding took place, or rates go up when the 2020 rate increase was implemented, et cetera. But then there are circumstances that just defy any explanation that is obvious to us. So if you look at this in May and June and July and August and September, this is a very steady service. 20 units are delivered every single month like clockwork. and it's being paid at an effective rate of $20, right? As all providers responsible for billing know, the rate's not part of the payment record itself, so that's imputed. What we get are the units and the payment amounts. So it's 20 units for $400, which means the effective rate is $20 per unit. But then in July, for reasons that, again, we're not aware of and really don't matter too much to our methodology, we're showing a payment rate of $380, which means the effective rate paid was $19 per hour. We don't know why that happened, but when we take a look at the information in combination, when we look at what was paid in May and June and August and September, it really feels to us like the rate ought to have been $20. So our methodology, in fact, will replace that $20 effective rate with a $20 per unit amount. We're going to price it up, in other words, because we don't know an obvious reason why it ought to have been priced down. Then we also have circumstances that are the other side of that coin, where once again, when we take a look at things, it's always 20 units, always $400, except for reasons unknown. Here in the middle, we have 20 units that were paid at $420. We don't know why. Maybe 21 units were delivered and 20 was on the payment record incorrectly. We think it probably ought to be $20 because that's what May and June and August and September suggest. But we don't want to be in a position where we're pricing down legitimate payments. And so I don't know that this is an illegitimate payment, and I'm not going to assume that it is. So in this case, although it looks to us like the rate ought to have been $20, we're going to keep it at $21. And the kind of bottom line explanation that I'm using for why it is our decision rules have come out like this is that when we recognize that there was the potential for some sort of error, we wanted to put our thumb on the scales for the provider. So you'll see that our approach to both of these scenarios is to the provider's benefit, right? In scenario number one, where it looks like the claim has been undervalued, we're going to price it back up. But then in the scenario number two, where it looks to us like that payment has been overvalued, we think it ought to have been $400, but it was $420, we're going to keep it at $420. We're not going to price it down. Now, there's some very narrow exceptions to that. If the rate was much, much lower, rather than coming out to $19, let's say it came out to $1 or $1.50, we wouldn't be pricing it all the way back up to $20. But our threshold is really quite generous. As long as it's more than 20% of the surrounding rate, so to speak, it gets priced up. But if it's less than 20%, our assumption is that there's something unique or markedly different about that payment record. It was probably a payment adjustment that our cleaning methodology did not catch. But otherwise, you can, and of course, in that circumstance, the provider is still not penalized, right? We don't price it down; it just stays at the actual payment amount. But you can see, when you take a look at these scenarios, which is again a very simplified version of what our formulas are doing. In both circumstances, we had a decision to make. What should we do? Should we take path A or door A or door B? And if door B is going to be the provider's benefit, that's the one that we chose. So again, I only have 2 slides about that step 2, the repricing, and that really is, at least half of the work. But we want to make this as high level as is practicable, and certainly for those folks who really want to delve into the details, when we share the worksheets with you, you'll be able to follow step by step through what it is we've done. And so then that takes us to step number 3, which I then subdivided to 3A and 3B. But this is really pretty straightforward at this point in time. Or I should say, once we get to the stage, everything following is straightforward. So what we're doing now is for each individual, we're going to count their months of service, and then we're going to sum up their repriced payments. And so this individual received services in 5 months. We can call him Stephen. You'll see we have this weird circumstance in July where for some reason the payment happened to have been split between the month. So the first payment covered 10 units at $190, and the second payment was 10 units at $200. But that still only counts as 1 month, right? Because we're looking at the number of months of service. So May, June, July, even though there's 2 records, that counts as 1, August and September. Then we're going to look at the repriced payments, and that's $2,164, right? Because some of these, this one in particular, gets priced back up to $20. And then ultimately 8.2% has been added as well, which is why this grows actually from $20 to $2,164. But you can see we handle this $19 and price it all the way up to $21.64 for the reasons I outlined on the previous slide. So that's done at the participant level. And then ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at all of the participants in combination for that vendorization, for that service code, and for that subcode. And so Stephen has the fortunate UCI of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's the 2164 that we saw on the previous slide coming from right here, and the 5 months as well, May through September. Then Stephen's good friends, 457, 458, and 459, got varying amounts of service and varying rates as well. But you can see that in total, we're talking about $14,000, $14,076 of repriced payments, 31 consumer months, so adding the 5 here, the 10, and the 12, and the 4, and then simply dividing those two numbers. 1476 divided by 31 means the effective rate for this vendorization, service code, and subcode is $454.06. So step 3 is a little anticlimactic given step 1 and 2, but at this point, it really is a matter of doing some addition, a little bit of multiplication, and then some division. So things that we're fairly competent in. So we wanted to talk briefly about next steps. Oh, actually, what I wanted to do, let me stop myself. I'm going to actually, well, here. Sorry for stumbling a moment. The next steps include the establishment of authorization. So we're still working with DDS about what that file is going to look like, but certainly there's a lot of authorizations to be established. So to the extent that that can be automated by us putting together a standardized file format, we're looking to do that. In addition to the authorizations, we are going to be sharing files with regional centers that will ultimately be further distributed onto the vendors themselves. And I wanted to provide a quick preview of those two pieces of information. And so I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint and I will pull those up. The first is the methodology document. Sorry. I hit the wrong button. So here we go. So this is that lengthy document that I talked about. So although the PowerPoint is a distillation of what it is we presented, for those folks who really want to understand all the moving pieces, this lengthy document kind of walks it through. It's not written necessarily in the most accessible language. It's fairly complex, but we wanted to be precise in terms of our documentation. So it's organized by detailing what subcodes are excluded. Then the data preparation, which is just what fields that we're going to be pulling. The idea here is that if you wanted to recreate our methodology, we welcome you to do so. And ideally, of course, the results would be exactly the same. But then here in the data cleanup is those 29 different checks that I was talking about. I'm certainly not going to walk you through any of those or really all of them, other than just to select one that just shows you kind of when we're going through this exercise, how the results are intuitive when you look at them in concert, but it just requires that effort for us to do some spot checking and then write decision rules to accommodate it. So in this circumstance, we're seeing a payment adjustment, just like I talked about in the PowerPoint, where there's 3 different approaches to handling these retroactive rate increases. And in this particular example, this was scenario 1 in the PowerPoint, they took the number of units of service that were originally billed, and then they just added the marginal increase, which was $4.48. So for March of 2019, we have 2 records, both with 21 units, but with markedly different effective rates. So as I talked about in the PowerPoint, the right answer is to add up the payment amounts, but not the billed number of units. So like in the PowerPoint, it was $500, right? 480 plus 20, but not 40 units plus 40 units. It was still just 40 units. The same thing is true here. So you can see when we move from left to right, the payments have been added, but the units themselves have not been added. So it wasn't 42 units of service that were delivered, it was only 21. And when you look at that in combination with the other records for this same participant, it's obvious that that's the right answer, right? Because although there was a gap for some reason in services, when they picked services back up in June and August, the rate was 155.23, which is the result that we got to once we went through our cleaning process of combining these two records. And so we wanted to provide not just the explanation, but also an excerpt, and almost all of these are real excerpts. So this is a real set of payment records from a specific regional center for a specific service code. This exists in the file. There's only one or two examples that we did that were based upon things that can hypothetically occur rather than what we actually saw. But out of the 29 records, I think 26 or 27 of them were real conditions that we had to test for. But we think that this summary of the actual payment record itself really helps to illustrate the point about why the decision that we made is the right decision. That when you take a look at the rate paid in the subsequent months, it's clear that that should have been at 155.23, and this was a payment adjustment rather than some really weird service that's being reimbursed at $4.48 per hour. Or this is technically a daily rate in this circumstance. So we walk through all 29 steps over quite a few pages. And then we get to the repricing aspect of this. And this, I think, is a mere 21 steps. So we aimed for efficiency by the time we got to step number 2. Again, I'm not going to walk through this with you here today, but I'm going to point out the level of detail that went into this, so that if you're really interested in what our approach was, you will have our documentation. And then also, we try to provide some color commentary in a lot of cases about why it is we're doing what we're doing. So you don't see this language for every one of those 21 steps. Some of them are pretty straightforward, right? We calculate the effective payment rate by dividing the payment amount by the units. And I think everyone would understand why we're doing that, because we need to know what the actual rate was to do comparisons to minimum wage files and bridge funding files and the like. But when there's something that's a little bit more complex, we try to provide an explanation as to why we're doing what it is we're doing. And so I'm going to share one final document now. That's, again, not quite a complete file, but it gives you a sense of what will be being delivered at the vendor, or really FEIN level. And so we put this document together that illustrates what some of the methodologies are doing. So it's a complement to what you saw in the written documents. Ultimately, what you'll be getting from a regional center, from the regional centers for your FEIN in particular, will not include the circles and the blue text or any row breaks. It's just going to be one block of information. But we wanted to present this both so you could be exposed to some of the formulas that we're using here if you wanted to test them for yourself, but then also to illustrate why some of the methodological steps are happening in the manner in which they're happening. So without the circles and the blue italicized text and these red explanations, this is going to be exactly the information that each vendor will be receiving if they're so inclined to go through this in detail. So as we talked about in the PowerPoints, and then again in the methodology documents, these are the fields that are being pulled from the payment record. And this is after it's been cleaned and recompiled. So these are the adjusted unit amounts. So it's not going to show 80 units like in that example in the PowerPoint. It's only going to show 40. But there would be a separate file or separate worksheet within this workbook, which I don't have in here in the example, that shows the raw payment record. So we're going to show you the raw payment records that we received. This will be the summarization that we conducted based upon our 29-stage cleaning process. And then the remainder of this is just walking through those 21 steps, step by step by step. And so you can see exactly the repricing exercise that has taken place. And just for completeness sake, I'll just point out a couple of things. So we talked about when there's a rate that's higher than we anticipated it was going to be. And you can see that here, where every month it was 70.29. And for the month of October, for some reason, it jumped to 76.57. We're ultimately going to keep that 76.57. It doesn't get priced down. We keep it there. We think it probably should have been 70.29, but if our test is is erring on the side of the provider, erring on the side of the provider means we keep it where it's at rather than pricing it down. The reverse example is here, where the rate's 155 every single month. And then again, for reasons that are not clear to us, in May, the price dipped down to 150.75. We're not sure what happened, but it sure looks to us that the ongoing rate ought to be 155.23. So that gets priced back up. We don't bake in a permanent decrease there when we're calculating the monthly rates. And then finally, when we're talking about what the more bottom line inclined folks are going to be looking at, here are individual level records. So this is for, again, a made up vendorization and some made up UCIs, and then different subcodes. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is because we're calculating this at the FEI, or we're distributing this at the FEIN level. If you have two vendorizations for that same FEIN, they're going to be included in the same file. However, because there's PHI certainly involved in these files, both in terms of the payment records themselves and even the summary level information, we can't share complete files with regional centers. Regional centers are only entitled to information associated with the participants in their catchment area, as I understand it. So that means if you're a company with an FEIN that serves multiple regional centers, you're going to be getting different files from each of the regional centers that you provide services to, just because that's the avenue through which information is being distributed, and for HIPAA compliant reasons, we can't provide complete files to the regional centers. But this then shows the roll-up information at the participant level for each of the 12 months in the year, and you can see that sometimes people don't get services in each of 12 months, but they're repriced payment amounts. And then ultimately the average monthly rate for that person, which isn't really necessary, but we do that for transparency's sake. The number of member months, which is critical, as well as the total payments, which is also critical. Because then finally, the ultimate step is saying, what's the bottom line rate going to be? And you can see that for this FEIN, we have two vendor IDs, 456 and 789, and a total of 3 different combinations of vendor and subcode, sub 1, sub 2, and then sub 1 once again for the second vendorization, which means we're looking at 3 different rates. Right, so we have 456 sub 1, 456 sub 2, and 789 sub 1. The number of member months associated, or consumer months associated with that particular vendorization and subcode, the total payments. Again, this is all being taken directly from this sheet, so it's just summing up what we find here in the total payments column and the member months column, and then calculating what the average monthly rate is, which is one number divided by the other. So ultimately, this is the level of detail that regional centers will be distributing on DDS's behalf to the vendors. It's going to have the original payment records. It's going to have our cleaned payment records, as well as the repricing methodology. It's going to have this roll up at the individual level. And then it's going to have finally the roll up at the vendor level, which is going to have the rates attached to them as well. Now I will return to the PowerPoint presentation, and I think I'm turning some of the next steps over to Jim at this point. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, I think you're taking it from here, Jim.
Yeah, and thanks, Stephen, and appreciate that. And I know some folks, you know, when we said, hey, this was going to be high level, and there's some folks will go, well, that was kind of detailed for high level. And then others are going to say, hey, I really want some more, really want to get into the details. And certainly, as Stephen mentioned, the document with all the data will be sent out to everyone, so you'll have that chance to walk through that and get as detailed as you want. So I do appreciate, Stephen, you taking the time to give this walkthrough. Now, knowing that certainly this is different than the rates that have been set up before, and even though it is for each provider the payments that they receive, that their folks are going to have some questions. And that's understandable. So after providers, after there's a review of the information that's sent, if there are some questions, we will have a process that's going to be what we're looking to do is design a template that if there are some specific questions in the calculations that you have some questions about, you think were not done correctly, that you'll be able to fill out in a very uniform way. A way to then send that to the regional center to say, hey, this is where I think there might be some adjustments needed in the way that rate was calculated. So that's coming. Some other things that are coming as well, and I know we said we wanted to keep this about rates, but and we will. But I also want to let you know there are some further directives that are going to come out along with this rate process, but also about how the reporting is going to be done. It's going to be online, and we'll give some information about how that's going to be done here coming up very shortly over the next several days. So do appreciate that there are many questions outstanding, not only on the rates, but also with some of these other questions that need to be done. And so that we're trying to get those addressed as quick as possible. Also, Stephen mentioned certain subcodes that won't have a monthly rate, like mileage and the incentive payments for employment. It doesn't mean that those can't happen, can't occur. They'll just be paid in the typical way. So if mileage occurs for those services that aren't, that are in addition to transportation for all those mileage, then those will get paid and reimbursed the same way. But so that, as well as there are some service codes that where a monthly rate's not going to be established. We've mentioned some things in the past, things like if it's a vehicle modification or things like that, those will not have a monthly rate established, even though it's a transfer or a non-residential service. Services that applies to, where there won't be a monthly rate, as well as service or subcodes, we'll be getting out a directive on that coming up as well too. So again, we don't have all of those answers right now today, but they will be forthcoming. So although I went right to, hey, if there's a disagreement, and I think Stephen mentioned this too on the rate calculation, you can do as a provider, can do a quick check of the way that the rate was calculated to begin with based on the information that you have now. Looking at your actual payments, doing some changes that were received, especially if we look at, adding some of the January increases that you would have received, taking off bridge funding if it was, and doing an overall average based on the average number of people that were served during the month, you probably will get to pretty close to what Burns and Associates has calculated. So I want to go to the next page then for some other things. And I know we have a lot of questions that have come up. And so I know we've answered, or there's some that have come up in the chat. And these are some of the questions that have come up and likely will continue to come up. We are going to post these and others in update our frequently asked questions. And if you haven't received or don't know where those are found on our website, we'll send out that link. And we'll go through some of these that we received prior to the meeting, and then we'll get into some that we've received during the meeting. So Stephen, do you want to cover this first one?
Sure, thank you, Jim. The first one's actually a summation of what we just walked through. So for those folks who were disappointed that it wasn't high level enough, this is our attempt to be really high level. But it really talks about the fact that we're looking at services delivered March of 19 through February of 20. One of the important things I wanted to point out here, because we have received this question, is the time frame for the payment dates. And so because there's been a little bit of a long fuse on this, the file that we received includes all the payments that were made through June of 2020. So 120 days after that last month of service that we're looking at. If folks submitted a very late claim beyond that 120-day limit, right now it's not included in the data that we have, and therefore is not part of the rate calculations. We talked about then the repricing exercise, accounting for any rate changes related to bridge funding, the January 2020 rate increase or minimum wage adjustments. Then we're summing things up at the individual level based upon their utilization from that 12-month baseline period and what we believe to be the appropriate current rate. Effectively, what's happening is a weighted average of those consumers' monthly averages, because obviously we're treating it by the number of consumer months. So if you only had one consumer month, you don't get weighted as heavily as someone who got 12 months worth of service. And as Jim mentioned, although we had to do quite a bit of work to handle those 10 or 12% of records that did not tie out the way we expected them to do, we are saying that 88 or 90% of records do tie out exactly as we anticipated. So if you were to do this exercise on your own, we would anticipate that you're going to come very, very close to our results. and hopefully that is, reduces the number of reviews that are going to be necessary, because we're very hopeful and confident that you ought to be within a couple of dollars of what we've come up with, because we ought to be working from the same data set and the same underlying vision and approach to how it is we're doing that. And as we mentioned, ultimately, we'll be sharing a lot more detail for those folks who really do want to go through this line by line. If you see a big discrepancy and I were in your shoes, I'd want to do that as well. So a couple other questions that I can handle before I turn it back over to Jim. We've been asked, are the rates going to vary by subcode? And the answer to that is yes. We actually see quite a bit of variability within a service code when there's multiple subcodes oftentimes. That's not always true, but it's true often enough where it made sense to us that we weren't going to be combining subcodes. So there will be, yes, in fact, a different monthly rate for each service code to subcode combination for a given vendorization. We also talked about how we are going to be distributing information, and I covered this at the very top because I thought it was important. Given the way that vendorization is done in California, there was obviously the potential that many providers are going to be would be getting lots and lots, to use a non-technical term, of files if we were going to produce a different file for each vendorization. So what we're doing is producing files at the FEIN level, which allows us to roll together many of those vendorizations. I mentioned already, though, that it's going to be for the FEIN within that regional center, and that just goes back to HIPAA compliant purposes. Because there's PHI in there, we can't produce a overall file that gets shared with the regional centers. It has to be limited to the individuals served within that regional center. We're in the final stages of producing those files. The work of doing the cleaning and repricing is largely done. As you can imagine, extracting information from those resultant files for several thousand providers is a little bit of an effort on our part. We're not quite cutting and pasting, certainly, but it takes a little bit of time to write the script necessary in order to do those extractions, and then to make sure that we're doing QA so that everything's working as we hoped that it would. And so with this, I think I'm going to kick this back over to Jim to take us home with the remaining FAQs before we turn it back over to Julia and company to address those questions that have been coming through the chat or the Q&A function through Zoom.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And so the next one is if you don't agree with the rate. So I touched on that. So there will be a process for doing that. We'll for questioning the rate and what information you'll need to provide to the regional center so that we can do an evaluation of that. So a directive will be coming out on that soon with that process. When does this start? So the monthly rates are slated to start with services that are provided in November. If we go to the next questions, and so we've had some questions. Will there be specific subcodes for these services? And that's the anticipation. Yes, is that, what I didn't mention, but certainly we has been discussed before, is that based on the needs of the individuals that are served, a given provider may be able to provide services to some individuals kind of in the traditional way. So they want to continue using, whether it be an hourly, daily, what have you type of rate, and provide those same types of services. But there may be some individuals, because of the needs, situations, they have some different requirements for support. You may want to use alternative services. And so that's when the monthly rate would apply. So we will have a standard subcode for when the alternative rates are applied. Another question is, hey, what about for individuals who start after February, because the calculation only used data through February of 2020. So what this does, it sets a monthly rate for all individuals. So it doesn't matter when they started. So if you get a new individual comes in to receive services, that same monthly rate would apply. And the other one is, future minimum wage increases be incorporated into the monthly rates. Yes, so there'll still be the opportunity for rate changes due to the increase in the minimum wage. I also saw in the chat, there was a question about, hey, what about services that are slated to get an increase in January? So specifically infant development programs, independent living and early start specialized therapeutic services. So those rate increases would still be applicable beginning in January if for alternative services as well. And then, and we'll get to the questions that have come in during the chat or during the presentation as well. But for folks, even afterwards, if we don't get to your questions, one, we're going to save we're printing and saving all the questions that have come in either through the chat and the Q&A section. We'll update our frequently asked questions on our website. That's going to be a running document or a running update. But if there's some things that we don't get to, or you didn't get a chance to type them into the chat, you can follow up with this email to this email address, and we'll get to those as well, and likely add those to our frequently asked questions too. By the way, and I don't know if you mentioned, Charlotte, but we'll post this presentation as well on our website, along with some other documents. Eventually, like I said, we'll get the methodology that Stephen mentioned, as well as some sample spreadsheets that have some of that won't be, so that for folks that want to get in and see some of the nuts and bolts about how the calculation was done. So those will be posted on our website as well. So I guess now if we want to turn to some of the questions that have come up, and then I think Julia Lowe was gonna kind of go through some of those questions, and we'll go back between Stephen and I and answer those.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yasser and I are going to ask you some questions. We've compiled a list and kind of sorted through what's come through the Q&A. There are a lot of questions, and as you noted, some of them are kind of to the side of the topic at hand today. So we're trying to focus the questions that we ask you on behalf of the audience to those that are most directly tied to the monthly rate. The first two are pretty easy. They're about clarifications from the PowerPoint itself. For the last slide example, somebody wanted to check to make sure that example is for a client that participates in alternative service. That monthly rate would pertain for alternative service.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then somebody asked a question about one of the graphics. I think it's slide 9 where you gave the overview of the calculation. The question is, are units equivalent to number of clients? So you had a graphic there.
The answer to that is no. And I try to be a little bit clearer on the text below the circle, but that's for a payment record. So the units apply to the number of units of service, whether we're talking about hours, days, or something else delivered in that month for that payment record. And payment records are always individual specific.
Thanks, Stephen.
The next question is about billing. So will the monthly rate be prorated if an individual enters or leaves in the middle of the month?
Yeah, the answer is no, because this is a monthly rate, so it's not going to be prorated. There won't be a half or a partial month.
I have a question about transportation. The question is, would we use the same method for transportation services?
Somewhat. So, and it kind of depends. So, as Stephen was talking about, there are some different ways that in some ways services are paid for. Transportation is another one that has some kind of variation, and there's some other services that in some cases maybe aren't paid by the person, if you will, and sometimes that the transportation may be paid by how many miles a transportation company drives, or the number of hours or routes that are done. So haven't got all the details worked out, but it'll essentially work out to what we're talking about here. But it'll start kind of similarly to what Stephen described, looking at the total amount that was reimbursed over that 12-month period, with some adjustments for rate changes as applicable. But then we'll also want to, the part that will need to be factored in that are not available in the data that Stephen has, is the average number of people that were served during during that period of time in a per month. So you'll end up with basically an average amount that was reimbursed per month and an average number of individuals that were served during the given month. And then the alternative rate and the amount that the provider would be reimbursed going forward would be basically a function of the percentage of the usual number of people that were served. So if a provider transportation who is not reimbursed by person typically serves 100 people during a month prior to March of 2020, and going forward, they served 80 people doing some form of alternative services, then that 80 out of 100 is 80%. That reimbursement for that month would be 80% of that typical amount. We still have to work through and kind of spell out those details and how that's going to work, but that's envisioning where we're going to end up with transportation. At the high level, that's very similar to what we're doing for other services. It's based on, if other providers provide alternative services to 80% of the folks in total, that reimbursement would be about 80% of what was received prior to March as well.
Thanks, Jim.
The next question is, just to be clear, is there going to be a different rate per vendor?
Yes, and it's going to be based on the amount that vendor was reimbursed in the number of over that 12-month period and the number of months in total of service that were provided.
And just to reiterate, to go a step deeper than that, it's by vendor, by service code, and by subcode. So a given vendor may in fact have multiple rates if they're providing multiple services or multiple subcodes within a service.
So the next question, we got the same question asked in kind of a number of different ways, but the most important thing is, when will we get these files? Will vendors have them before November 1st with the rates in them?
Yeah, and yes, we did. I think we mentioned it earlier, but just to reiterate, and I know is that the files will start being available next week, and so they'll be coming out to vendors next week. I don't know exactly the day, and it's gonna in some cases depend on kind of how quickly they can then be distributed. But next week is what is the target.
Thanks.
Next one is, how do we calculate monthly rates for the early start population? Is this just the average during a previous period to now, or is it the current, or is it client specific?
I'm going to read into that question a little bit, and so if I'm reading it incorrectly, the questioner can resubmit. What I think they're getting at is kind of the transitory nature of the early start population, that a lot of those folks will have aged out by the time the alternative services models begin being reimbursed in November. But that's why we're not doing, one of the reasons we're not doing individual specific rates. So what we're taking a look at is, at that vendorization level, how much service have you typically delivered to in this case, a child receiving early start services? And that will be the rate that is used for any children who you're still delivering services to, as well as the rate for any new children that you begin delivering services to.
So what about those of us that have hourly rates rather than monthly rates?
And so the methodology is agnostic towards what the unit of service is. So it covers monthly rates, it covers hourly rates, it covers daily rates. What we're interested in is, again, determining the number of units of service, regardless of what those units of service were. So are you typically delivering 100 hours or 20 days, or obviously no more than 1 month of service, and then repricing that at the appropriate rate for that monthly, daily, or hourly rate. So ultimately, everything then gets rolled up to the monthly level, right? So if you have 100 hours of service during a month, on average, we price that out at the appropriate rate. And then, of course, we multiply the 100 by that appropriate rate to come up with a monthly amount. That becomes the monthly amount for that payment record. We go through the same exercise for every single month of service that you delivered, add all of those up, and then divide by the number of months of service within this data set that we're working with.
The next question is about calculating and using consumer months. And the question's, how do you calculate consumer months? Is this prorated per day? This can skew numbers if some or one started mid-month or only attended very few days in the month. It will reduce the average. And a very similar question to that, how does the count of member months figure into the monthly rate?
Sure. So we're defining member months as delivering a unit of service during that month. We do not make any attempts to prorate that or standardize it across individuals served by a given vendor. I think it's important to highlight, though, why that largely holds true with the other components of this methodology or this reimbursement approach. First, for those folks who historically receive relatively limited services, it's likely that they're going to continue to receive relatively limited services, but you're going to have this full average rate that you're going to bill for them. So yes, the folks who tend to get more services, the monthly rate's going to be less than what you would typically bill. But for the folks who traditionally get fewer services, the monthly rate's going to be a lot more than you traditionally bill. So on that basis alone, it didn't make any sense to make any adjustments to the amount of services that were delivered based upon some folks just traditionally using fewer services during a month. Similarly, although not identically, for those folks who entered service mid-month, we similarly did not make any adjustments there, but I'll tie this back to a question that Jim addressed earlier about prorating services. We're similarly not penalizing providers or vendors when folks enter service mid-month or leave services mid-month, right? You'll still be able to access the full monthly rate as long as you delivered some service during the month, even if someone started on the 29th or left services on the 2nd. So once again, it didn't make any sense for us to do any sort of proration on the front end when we're calculating, because we're handling the actual payments the same way that we handled the methodology, where a day of service or an hour of service during the month counts as a full month of service, both in our calculation of the rates as well as the rules that will govern billing for these services.
So this is a question about POSs that began mid-month. How did Burns & Associates deal with the purchase of service contracts that started or ended mid-month? It's believed that this impacts the monthly calculations.
Yeah, and that I think is an extension of the previous question. So it really is the same idea.
Okay. The next one's about future minimum wage adjustments. And Jim, I think you briefly touched on this already. The question's, how will 2021 minimum wage adjustments work with this new rate methodology?
Yeah, I did mention that. And so, yes, rate adjustments will be available for as applicable when the minimum wage goes up. For those of you that have gone through that process where there's a request, we may change that request form a little bit to account for monthly rates, but we'll get information out on that certainly before January so that providers can work to gather the information and can submit those requests to us. Also, just wanted to add on, there's another question that I saw too about when we talk about minimum wage, we are talking about state minimum wage. So and I know, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about local minimum wage, but the minimum wage increases that we're talking about are only applicable when the state minimum wage goes up.
So here's a question. What if we're providing the traditional services through Zoom? Will our rates be affected?
So again, I kind of mentioned it earlier when you're talking about traditional services and even taking a step back, that is the overall preference. I mean, for most individuals, that was through their individual program planning process that those services were identified as the need. So if those services can be provided, whether remotely through Zoom or maybe somewhere different than they were provided before, then that billing, claiming, what have you, continues the same way as it was before. So same service, even though it's delivered in somewhat of a different way, still is the same service and same billing and same rate.
Okay. I think we might have time for 2 more questions, and I'll go ahead and ask them both, Yasser.
Okay.
Will for the regional centers rate table, which includes the minimum wage increases, will those be applied to the user regional centers in case they have not updated their user regional center rate tables yet? Kind of technical here.
Yeah, so that's a question. I think that kind of gets to, you know, especially for providers that provide services to multiple regional centers, and will that rate for that provider go across regional centers, or will it be individualized per center? So we're still working through some of that data. I don't have an exact answer on that yet, but we will have that one shortly.
Okay. And then this last question is a little bit to the side of the calculations, but I think people really want to know. Understanding that some vendors are going to change from an hourly rate to a monthly rate, there's a question that the regional centers billing portals won't currently allow them to change the rate, only the hours of service provided. So how is that going to be handled?
Can you repeat that question? That may be a little more technical than we can probably answer today, but
I believe this is a provider asking, saying that the regional centers billing portals don't allow them to change the rate. They can only change the hours of services that are provided. So
yeah,
what should a provider do?
Yeah, and so we are working with our information technology folks as well as the regional centers to do updates to be able to accept and then process these monthly rates. So
in other words, the provider doesn't need to do anything to make that change happen. It'll happen on the back end.
Yep.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of other unanswered questions. We totally recognize that. We will make sure that we incorporate into the FAQs. We're keeping all of the chat, and I believe that some questions have also come into the email box for viewers that were on the YouTube live stream. And so we'll work through all of those. But I think that we've reached the end of our time here.
Great. And again, I really do appreciate the time that you've spent listening through this. There is the detailed information will be out shortly. We'll post it. And then I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Julia, we'll be able to send out emails to everyone who's registered for this and let them know when the updates have been made to the website.
We'll let them know that it's there. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll let folks know that it's there. I know that there are still many questions to go, not just about the rates, but also the implementation. As I said at the beginning, this is something that just taking a look at just COVID in general, we didn't know everything to begin with, and we're working through it, and we're continuing to do that with this too. So your questions and your involvement is very important, and really do appreciate all that you all do in whatever role you play in supporting individuals and their families. So thank you again for the time, and take care and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.